The first area of difference between conservatives, I guess the first major divide, is on religion. The first thing to note here is that Americans tend to be quite religious compared to other industrialized, developed nations. So the issue of religion is still quite important in politics for us. However, there is a strong wave of secularity in conservatism, as evidenced by the growth of libertarians within the Republican and conservative side, and the existence of the Tea Party, which has a combination of highly religious people, but also very much focused on the issue of economic freedom and not religious at all. And so this graph sort of represents that overlap and also the areas of independence. So about 26% of Tea Party members are libertarians. They're quite secular. 61% of libertarians are not identifying with the Tea Party. 52% of the Tea Party members identify with the Christian right, and 78% of libertarians do not identify with the Christian right. So there's quite a bit of diversity within this group and quite a bit of difference in the logic that motivates their behavior. But overall, the thing that they favor is the status quo and traditional authority structures. And so the classical conservative stance, as sort of a reminder, is that the state should be strong. The state institutions should be strong, and individuals and economics should be controlled in an authoritative fashion. The original conservatives, going back to the French Revolution, were those who supported royal control, the monarchy. So that's your classical conservatism. The existing power structures are, in some cases, defined by God, and in others they're defined by tradition. We have no reason to dismiss them. And so that does allow for a lot of religious control as well. Now, neoconservatives usually are quite supportive of this religious concern. Where they break off from classical conservatives is they actually are in favor of foreign intervention in order to spread the values of democracy and capitalism. In a lot of ways, neoconservatives and neoliberals have quite a bit in common because they believe in this foreign intervention, and classical conservatives did not believe in foreign intervention. Being insulated and building up the state was the priority. I am skipping ahead of the few slides that are listed under the files page, so I encourage you to look at the entire PowerPoint here. But a few points that I wanted to make, just so we are sort of on the same page about the major traditions and who they are. Some of them I'm not covering, but I do encourage you to look over, for example, environmentalism, some of my notes on fascism as well. But socialism is considered one of the alternatives to liberalism, and definitely arises out of Karl Marx's theory and in response to liberalism, particularly liberalism as applied to economics. That's very important. So when it comes to control of these things, socialists tend to believe that the government or the people should have control over the economy, but there should be minimal control over individuals' lives. And that is a strict socialist standpoint. The way this is played out in reality has looked quite different when you look at socialist countries. There's a lot of diversity in how authoritarian government is used. For example, in Denmark, which is considered quite authoritarian, quite democratic, there are a lot of civil liberties, but that may not be as true in the country of China. So there is quite a bit of disagreement among the theoretical and political parties associated with socialism. And the biggest disagreement is on how you can move from capitalism into a more equitable form of economic life. The first principle of socialism is that free markets create inequality and that they should be replaced with command economy. The second principle is that our chances of a good life depend on our circumstances of birth and are not our fault. So this means that class conflict has really impacted every aspect of our society, and it is the main justification for our race systems, our gender systems, religion, gender. All of these things are really just facades to keep up the class divisions. So the biggest divide really has to do with whether or not social democracy can occur, or does it have to occur through state-owned, state-driven, authoritarian means. So social democrats, those that you see in places like, as I mentioned, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, they believe that you can arrive at economic equality and economic justice through democratic institutions. So they do things like encouraging unions, boosting wages, and developing a welfare state. Whereas state socialism focuses more on really concentrating power in a small group of people and tends to lead to hoarding of resources and corruption. So it's also very important to point out that socialism is quite different than communism. It is a step before communism. When the workers own the means of production, you have communism. When the government owns the means of production, then you have socialism. Another alternative mentioned is fascism. I would take exception to calling this a legitimate ideology, mainly because ideologies are things that tell us how society should work, and fascism tends to lead to the dismantling of society and has some elements within it that are actually about dismantling society. The first principle of fascism is nationalism and national purity. And I've put a question here about what we mean by nationalism. A lot of people, especially in the United States, but I would say this is true in other countries as well, tend to conflate nationalism and patriotism. And patriotism is a feeling of love and self-identifying with other citizens of your country. And nationalism is a feeling of national superiority and the tendency to need to purify the nation in order to get rid of any elements that don't quote unquote fit the nation. So this often leads to great amounts of violent nationalism, and so extreme hyper-nationalism is associated with fascism. And again, purification, purging of those who are illegitimate members of the nation is an important element that stands out about fascism. The second principle is a very hard right conservative acceptance and glorification of power and authority. A lot of this comes from a misreading of Nietzsche and his ideas about the Uberman, the Superman, and this became focused by the Nazis, or I'm sorry, not focused, but this became justification by the Nazis for their plan for a master race. And this principle also fights back against the idea of liberty. It is a reaction against liberalism. And this feeds into the third principle, which is the idea that the real people, the real members of the nation, the little guy, has been kind of mistreated by liberals, has been mistreated by the quote-unquote elites. And so the fascists often claim to defend the quote-unquote little guy. And they also blame liberals for upending traditional life, for rights and free markets. And so they encourage authoritarian takeovers of governments. And one final note, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, which became kind of shortened as the Nazis, has often been termed socialist. And I just want to point out that that is not a legitimate argument. Nazis were fascist. They do fit all of these definitions. They weren't socialist, however. Socialist actually believe in equitable distribution of resources, and that is far from what they did in Nazi Germany. They didn't allow some people to get access to resources at all, even the resource of life. In addition, socialism believes in equality between individuals, and Nazis clearly did not. Another major difference is that there was quite a bit of capitalism that was happening, a lot of free marketing that was happening under Nazi Germany. So I just wanted to make that clear to everyone. Do read more on the alternatives when we talk about environmentalism and Islamism. Those are important as well. I will very briefly discuss the major elements of political Islamism, if only to separate them from the people who practice Islam that most of us are most likely to come in contact with here in the United States. So essentially, it's a Northern African, Middle Eastern type of belief system that resembles fascism in a lot of ways. The glorification of violence, the focus on jihad and martyrdom, and Islamism, for example, does sort of float with the idea that some fascists have had, that dying for this cause and having others die for this cause is completely acceptable and important even. And the main point to remember is that most people who practice Islam do not subscribe to this belief. It is a very extremist form of belief system, just like fascism is a very extremist form of conservatism. So this is the major ideologies, most of the ones that we've talked about here, plotted on a left to right spectrum. On the left here, you see communism as kind of the most leftist, the most liberal, but I think, as you may have learned in this lecture, liberal doesn't always mean what we think it means. Sometimes it just means limited government. But the left to right spectrum traditionally, again, we've drawn this from the French Revolution, but we tend to think of it on the left to right scale as really representing less authoritarian to more authoritarian. But that gets a little confusing when you talk about who controls the economic resources. So that is one reason why when you take the ideology quiz, you will actually be plotted on an axis graph that has a horizontal and a vertical as well as a horizontal graph, so that you'll see where you fit in terms of government control of the economy as well as government control of one's personal life. So in this one, they've tried to collapse those things into one spectrum. So essentially, that's the main message here, that the left to right spectrum in terms of parties that we might be familiar with in the United States, this is where they line up. And also, obviously, outside of the United States, because the Nazi emblem there is from Germany. So to wrap up, I want to take a look at the general alignment of the American population over a time period starting from 1994. One of the things that the Pew Research Foundation that I'm showing here does is compiles a lot of data on public opinion and polling, and plots it on that left to right dimension. So we get to look at really how the majority of Americans look. And one of the things that they have observed is that we have become increasingly polarized over the last couple of decades. And what that means, polarization, is that we have become further and further apart, situated closer to the left and right ends of the spectrum, and much fewer people are occupying what we would call the center, the median of this left to right dimension. So quite simply, here is a video of the animation of plotting the percentage of Americans that vote left or right, and how far to the left or right they actually are over time. The blue represents Democrats and the red represents Republicans. So if you notice, we have a very sharp shift to the left and a lot of missing area in the middle. So just a quick correction, this represents the survey data of public opinion research on Democrats and Republicans, not just vote choice.